I suppose a certain amount of fear and anxiety is a good thing. Anxiety helps us solve problems for the future, to anticipate challenges. Otherwise, we'd be like cats, happily snoozing 21 hours out of 24. And fear, obviously, protects us from harm. It's a very important survival instinct. And when you come across people who appear to have no fear at all, you really want to avoid them. They are not safe company to keep. But I think that too much or inappropriate fear and anxiety can have the opposite effect. Rather than energizing us, they can have the effect of freezing us into inactivity, disempowering us, preventing us from being able to respond appropriately and to get things done. If we look at the Gospel reading from Luke chapter 8, where a group of disciples are with Jesus in a boat on the Sea of Galilee, and there is one of the characteristic sudden storms which get whipped up in that sea very unexpectedly. And understandably, the group of disciples is terrified. Jesus, however, who has fallen asleep, continues to slumber peacefully. In Mark's version of this story, the disciples angrily wake him and say, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" Luke, in common with Matthew, has slightly softened this challenge. Here, the disciples simply say, "Master, we are perishing." Jesus wakes up and calms the storm and criticizes them for their lack of trust in him, which one might think is slightly unreasonable in the circumstances. But be that as it may, the disciples are both reassured by what Jesus has done, but overcome by an entirely different kind of fear, a sense of awe. Who is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? Now, the unspoken response is that this person must be the very power of God himself. The reference to power over the weather, over the storm, would remind any early reader of this story of the Old Testament, in which God is depicted as the only force who can control the springs of the world, what makes things happen, including the very weather itself. And in the light of this very different kind of fear, this very different kind of awe, the disciples begin to be empowered to trust in Jesus further. There will, of course, be fits and starts. This is not a consistent progress. Obviously, the experience of Jesus' arrest and crucifixion renews their terror of failure, their terror that all the purposes of God in which they had trusted so implicitly have actually been shown to be false, that Jesus was no Messiah, that Jesus was a failure. And in fact, Jesus' crucifixion was going very likely to be followed by their own arrest, and not surprising that they scatter in all directions and abandon him in terror. But there is still the requirement to trust. And if we look at the two other readings, the reading from the book of Genesis, the Garden of Eden story, and the very strange chapter 4 from the extremely strange book of Revelation, I think there is something else that is calling on the requirement to trust in the good purposes of God. In the Garden of Eden story, it is not so much perhaps to be seen as a reconstruction of an ideal past, but a proclamation that the fundamental purposes of God, past, present, and specifically future, are not for his creatures to remain storm-tossed in a chaotic and dangerous world, but to be returned to a harmonious garden where all will be well. And I think much the same message is behind the book of Revelation. which is so often misunderstood as a series of bewildering and frightening predictions about the future, whereas it seems as if its fundamental purpose was, yes, to challenge the early Christians to keep the faith, but also to comfort them that behind the scenes, behind the appearance of the dominance in the world that they knew, the dominance of the powerful and cruel empires who were increasingly persecuting them for their faith, there was another reality, a deeper reality in which God was in charge, in which the 24 elders, representing perhaps the 12 apostles and in addition the tribes of Israel in some sort of symbolic way, are safely worshipping God in some glorified environment depicted in terms which will have made a lot of sense to the earliest readers who would have been familiar with the type of writing known as apocalyptic, but come across to us as very strange, bewildering, and quite often off-putting. I think the message of both these readings is that we have reason to trust. And of course, the fundamental trust that lies behind all the gospel reading is the proclamation of Jesus' resurrection. And once his followers had experienced this resurrection and come to believe it, then their fear was cast out and they were able to preach this gospel, even though threatened with terrible punishments, many of which were inflicted over the coming years. So, if I'm to take this proclamation seriously, what difference is it going to have in my life? Well, I think first of all, if I am not to be frightened of what people can do to me, then I too can be empowered as were the disciples. For if the resurrection really happened, if the last enemy, death, has itself been conquered, then fundamentally I have no reason to be afraid. And if I'm not afraid, then this should empower me to speak the truth, even when the truth is unpopular. It should empower me not to be worried about what people will think of me, how they will react. It will also give me the courage to be honest about my own failings, about my own weaknesses. For it is very often, it seems to me, fear of what people will think of us that causes us to conceal where we are weak, where we go wrong, to present a facade, a front to the world, which is fundamentally dishonest because it is not the real us. And finally, if I can overcome the fear, then rather than being frightened of people, I can perhaps learn progressively to love them as I get to know who they are, as I see beyond seeing them simply as threatening forces. I can overcome that fear and reach out to them in love and not make my love dependent on something I think I can get in return or in order to secure their approval or in the light of an approval I think I've already got. But irrespective of all those things, I can in fact reach out towards them with a practical and energized love. And so my faith in the resurrection, my faith in the good purposes of God, can empower and energize me to transform my life.